Me, along with 5 of my friends and colleagues, are working on our final capstone project as part of the Sheridan College Game Design program. Development will take place over 8 months and is split into 5 phases. This devlog is going to cover the second half of our project's conception phase, showing all of the concept art, narrative ideation, whiteboard meetings, and prototypes we created to validate our concept. I spent most of this milestone developing features for our game, just coming up with interesting things to do with our tether mechanic. The first thing I made was a door, but instead of just pushing it open the boring way, you open a door by grabbing it with your tether and pulling it. I find this interaction intuitive because it reinforces the idea that the tether is at the core of everything you do in this game. If a player's ever confused about how something works, grab it with the tether and see what happens. Next, I made a magical rock, where contact with the ground will cause everything close to it to bounce up in the air. I thought this was a fun and interactive way to introduce more mobility options. I spent most of my time on this next feature, which are the animals you save. During your adventure, you'll find lost animals all over the world that want to escape the storm, and you can save them by popping their bubble off of something sharp. Since the utility of our tether mechanic is so broad, I wanted to design a kind of bonus challenge that would get players to use the tether in creative ways. We just published an entire case study about developing these NPCs. We're also planning to have puzzles and combat scenarios, where you must use the objects around you to overcome a challenge. Our game has a big void where you could drop items and potentially have nothing to grab. That's why I designed an orbit that will always be full of floating debris. It could even be adjusted to fit any size of the island and have any number of debris. You can even throw other stuff into the orbit and watch it spin around. The final thing I worked on was achieving a stormy atmosphere. Since our setting is the inside of a massive storm, that's kind of a big part of our hook. The tornado cloud is a not so optimized particle effect that uses gravity to make everything spiral down. But we're gonna have to update this down the road to avoid our game running at 5 FPS.
Hi, this is Onona from the Design, Art, UI, Narrative team. This week, I mainly worked on developing the visual identity for Eye of the Storm. This included making mood boards that show the general aesthetics we want for the environment, and the atmospheric effects that we want to use to set the mood in-game. For this, I used the original idea for the game that we had, plus my love for sea-themed things, to make a unique look. We already knew, based on Alora and Deegan's game pitches from way back, that we wanted a game that was stormy and had a tether as a main mechanic. From this, and our past concept work from the art team, I decided on a few key things to reference. First off, storms. This means hurricanes or storms in general, and elements from them, like thunder, lightning, waterspouts, and vortexes in the sky. Another thing was surfaced ocean, or magic theme. I proposed the idea to have the game be aquatic, to give it a unique feel. Surfaced ocean means that our game would be taking place in the air, not in the water, but would have an aquatic theme anyways. I also made a mood board for inspiring creator designs. We decided early on that we wanted to make a game that's silly, family-friendly, and has cute, memorable little characters for the players to coo at. This is good not only for aesthetics, but also for ease of asset creation, less polygons, and for marketing purposes. It could be easier to draw in an audience with a mascot, theoretically.
Our team was off to a great start. We had a unique mechanic that seemed to really get people excited about our game, but we kept running into one major problem. What is the player really doing? We had not discussed the why of player actions, which meant as we tried to refine our concept, we kept hitting roadblocks. We needed to establish the context of our game. We needed a narrative. There were 2 main problems we needed to address with our narrative. 1, how can we bring the main draws of our game, tornadoes and tethers, together in a way that makes sense? 2, how can we ensure that our players will understand the story without shoveling paragraphs of lore down their throats? To find our footing, we discussed elements that we wanted to include in the narrative as a group. These elements were cute characters, a lighthearted tone, and an aquatic theme. With that out of the way, we began concepting some characters and settings, focusing on the questions: who can use the tether and why? Why is there a tornado? Why does the player character care, and why are they involved? The first idea I had revolved around an axolotl character who wanted to use his amphibious powers to rescue the poor sea critters who had gotten whisked away in the storm. While the character was very cute, there were definitely some holes in this idea. It still couldn't offer an explanation for why there was a tornado, or why the axolotl could tether. I decided to pivot to a more fantastical setting. In this version, the player is a shelled soldier sea sprite, helping his queen protect their people from the greed-stricken king. The king and queen sea sprites had the magical power of the ocean, but it wasn't enough for the king. He wanted the power of the air as well. In his pursuit, he inflicted a treacherous waterspout upon his people and took the opportunity to send his personal army to ransack and destroy his own kingdom. Leaning into the conventions of the fantasy genre gives us more wiggle room to explain aspects of the storm and the player's ability through magic. I'm also hopeful that the simplicity of the plot will help us avoid making the player read too much.
I was responsible for one version of the tether mechanic, which we called the lasso internally, and we wanted this lasso to be more of a dynamic, on-the-fly sort of tool. It allows players to pick objects up, carry them around, pull them into the player's hand, throw them, and even activate them. So, I spent some time working on 3 different versions of how the lasso might work. The first was a very static grab, holding the object from the midpoint. The second still held from the midpoint, but allowed the object to interact with the world and respond to physics. And the final, current version was holding the object from the point of contact, giving players more fine control over how they move things and takes advantage of the game's physics-driven gameplay. I also created some object prototypes to demonstrate how we could have different props that had different physics responses. There's a bomb, sort of like Brayden's bounce rock, but more of a handheld thing. The umbrella, which absorbs forces and transfers them to the player, and the shotgun, which blasts objects in front of the barrel, but also has pretty hefty recoil, launching the players backwards. One of my teammates then asked, what happens if you grab something that's unmovable? I thought it would be best if players could intuitively predict what would happen, and so why not use the same action, but in reverse? Instead of the player pulling the object pulls the player. So, now when a player tries to yank an object that's too heavy or stationary, they fly on top of it. When they try to pull it with their body, they snap back like a slingshot. And of course, even though our team specified that this tether wasn't a grapple hook, I had to at least try prototyping a grapple swing mechanic.
I spent most of my time working on the movable platforms, which would be the small floating islands that players could pull. I wanted so that players could stand on the floating islands, then use the tethers to pull the island to a direction and ride the islands. The platforms detect objects like a player and applies a force to it so that it matches the moving platform speed. However, for a player, that doesn't really work for now because of the movement script caps the player's maximum speed and always tries to set it to 0. For now, I changed the player movement script to have its max speed to be a combination of the object below's speed and the player's max speed parameters. It still doesn't support moving on the platform, so that will be looked into in the future. Then I added a feature to the movable platforms or islands where if the player stands on it, then it reaches high enough speeds, using the tethers for example, then hits an island, it will launch the player. I wanted a fast movement mechanic for the players when they need to go over large distances. I had Mario's long jump, Spider-Man swing, and Titanfall's grappling hook as a base inspiration, where they give a burst of speed and the player rides on it. I made a simple level for it, just a large area filled with the movable platforms. However, landing on the platform is quite difficult as players don't have full control over their speed in the air, so I added a grapple swing that was being made by John. It was already functional, so I just added it to my branch, then add grappleable points so players could stop and take full control of their speed again after the launch. If I have to be honest, the mechanic is cool and all, but I don't think it fits the game we are going for as of right now. I prefer if it was shelved after testing it or used sparingly throughout the game.
This week, I started on making a couple different things while we reached the end of our prototyping spree. The first thing I wanted to have ready was a proper sound mixer. I found a really interesting talk from the Just Cause developers regarding how they use sound profiles and mixer regulation to create a more immersive and dynamic auditory experience for the player. Since we were already going to be using Unity Sound Mixer, I thought it would be a good idea to make sure it was set up properly to allow for these options. I set up a basic implementation of it for now, but in the future I'll likely have to extend the amount of channels we have to make sure the more dynamic system works. Since our prototypes are in the process of being merged together and remade into a new controller, there wasn't really room to implement sound like I had wanted to. In the meantime, I had decided to make a sound design document that would cover all the sounds we would need and other techniques for programming and audio editing that we could use to adjust sound in our project. I also added some music playlists that contained different collections of OSTs from other games that had different attached themes so that we could begin to decide on a direction for how we wanted the music to be composed. The initial prototype that sold us on the concept art game explored using the tether mechanics for combat scenarios, so I wanted to bring that back to our discussions. I wanted to add guns as a start, but I didn't want the gun to overshadow the main mechanic. I solved this by making the player's controller throw guns when they ran out of ammo. To add a bit of spice to it, they also explode, making it honestly more fun to throw the gun than it is to use it. To showcase this, I made a small level that demonstrated how you could use this feature to defeat enemies, while also showing some more defensive applications of the tether in a combat-focused game environment. Lastly, I worked on a narrative concept I felt very impassioned by. Anona had made a concept art of a tired, stressed businessman, and I fell in love with the idea. I made a short PowerPoint presentation that conveyed the idea to see what the group's initial reception would be. After the first pitch, the reception seemed positive, so I fleshed it out a bit more, planning out a theme, aesthetic direction, and the characters that would be included. While it's unlikely that we'll be using much of the concept, it gave us some insight as to what style of writing we wanted to have for our story and sparked discussion on how we'll be handling the narrative going forward.